I had just shut off the engine, the smell of gasoline and oil still lingering on my hands and sleeves after a long day at the shop. With just one click of the remote, the garage door began to lift, revealing my spiritual child that I had spent nearly 2 years transforming from a pile of rusted metal into a perfect machine. The sunlight streamed in, glinting off the chrome trim and the deep, lustrous paint that seemed to absorb light like a black hole. Then suddenly, a piercing scream cut through the air. That man just stole my car. Call 911 now. Beverly Lang, my neighbor and HOA president, came charging across the lawn, phone pressed to her ear, mouth spewing accusations. While I still stood on my driveway, keys in hand, the sound of police sirens was already echoing from the end of the street. In just a few minutes, I would be treated like a thief for my property. My name is Ethan Miller, and I'm 32 years old. 6 months ago, I quit my job as an aerospace engineer to open a classic car restoration shop right here in my garage. The centerpiece was a 1968 Shelby GT 500 Eleanor that I'd inherited from my father, a former street racing mechanic who passed away when I was 15. Dad had started restoring this beauty, but never got to finish it. For me, completing this car wasn't just about horsepower and chrome. It was about connecting with the old man's memory, finishing what he started. Every bolt I turned, every panel I straightened, felt like having a conversation with him across the years. Beverly Lang was the kind of woman who made Homeowners Associations infamous. At 45, she sported a perfectly maintained blonde bob and carried her phone like a divine weapon. As both the HOA president and a luxury car broker, she had appointed herself the neighborhood's unofficial quality control manager. Her favorite pastimes included measuring grass height with a ruler and making my life miserable over what she called commercial activity in a residential zone. The woman had the supernatural ability to appear whenever I started Shelby's engine, clipboard in hand and righteous indignation on her face. "Officers, thank God you're here." Beverly practically threw herself at the first cop who stepped out of his cruiser. She was waving what looked like an official document, her voice pitched at that special frequency that could shatter wine glasses. "This man has stolen my car. I have the paperwork right here, the bill of sale from my client in Nevada. That's a 1968 Shelby GT 500. The way she looked at my car wasn't a casual concern. Her eyes held possessive hunger usually reserved for something desperately wanted but unattainable. What was stranger was how she rattled off the car's specifications with the precision of someone who'd done their homework, maybe too well. Officer Rodriguez, a stocky guy with tired eyes, approached me with the universal expression of someone dealing with suburban drama instead of actual crime. "Sir, do you mind if we take a look at your documentation for this vehicle?" His partner was already photographing the Shelby while Beverly provided running commentary about serial numbers and engine specifications that frankly impressed me with their accuracy. I handed over my registration, title, and insurance papers, all clearly showing my name and address. But Beverly was ready, producing what she claimed was a bill of sale showing Robert Mitchell from Las Vegas had purchased this exact car from her last week for $75,000. "Mr. Miller," Officer Rodriguez said after examining both documents, "this is unusual. The lady has paperwork showing she sold this car, but your documents show continuous ownership. Can you prove this vehicle has been in your possession for an extended period?" I smiled because if Beverly wanted to play this game, I was ready to play by my own rules. What she didn't know was that my father had been paranoid about car theft back in his racing days, and this Shelby had more hidden surprises than she could imagine. "Officer, I've got progress photos, restoration videos, and a complete build log going back 22 months. But more importantly, if you pop the hood, you'll find something interesting carved into the engine block." As we walked toward the car, I caught Beverly shooting a glance toward the sky, following her gaze to what looked like a small drone hovering near the tree line behind my house. Strange, since none of my neighbors were tech hobbyists. Beverly quickly looked away when she noticed me watching, but something about that moment felt off. During our argument, she'd made an odd comment. "Harold always said cars like this are incredibly valuable." I had no idea who Harold was, but the way she said it suggested this wasn't just about neighborhood rules or money. There was something bigger going on here, something that made Beverly confident enough to call the police on a lie and expect to win. The officer lifted the hood, and there it was. D. Miller 1995 etched into the engine block in my father's careful handwriting, along with our old address. Beverly's face went through several interesting color changes as she tried to explain how her Nevada client could have purchased a car with someone else's name permanently carved into the engine. "Well, perhaps there's been some confusion," she stammered, but her voice had lost that earlier confidence. Officer Rodriguez looked from Beverly to me and back again, clearly realizing something wasn't right about this situation. "Ma'am, I think we need to see additional documentation about this alleged sale." As Beverly fumbled with her phone, probably trying to contact whoever had helped her fabricate those documents, I noticed something else strange. She knew way too much about my car's technical specifications, details that weren't visible from casual observation, and certainly weren't the kind of thing a luxury car broker would memorize about someone else's vehicle. She'd mentioned the 428 Cobra jet engine, the specific gear ratio, even the custom exhaust system I'd installed last month. Either she'd been studying my car very carefully for a very long time, or someone had been feeding her information. Officer Rodriguez closed his notepad and looked at Beverly with the expression of someone who'd realized they'd been called out on a domestic dispute about to become complicated. Ma'am, I need you to come to the station and clarify some details about this alleged transaction. Mr. Miller, we may need additional documentation, but for now, this appears to be your vehicle. Beverly's face flushed red as she realized her plan had collapsed spectacularly, but as the officers prepared to leave, she played one final card. Fine, but I'm calling my lawyer, and I'm calling Harold Green about this. We'll see how confident Mr. Miller feels when he's dealing with people who understand how these things work. The police left with Beverly's promise to sort out her documentation issues, but I stood in my driveway long after the patrol cars disappeared, staring at that drone still hovering in the distance. Something about this whole situation felt orchestrated, like Beverly had been expecting this confrontation and prepared for it, but she'd also seemed genuinely surprised when her plan fell apart, which made me wonder if she was working with someone who hadn't prepared her well enough. If Beverly Lang thought she could intimidate me into giving up my father's car, she was about to learn that the Miller family doesn't back down from a fight, especially when we're holding all the cards. The next morning, I called Emily before my coffee had even finished brewing. My sister had always been the practical one in the family, which is probably why she chose law school while I was busy getting grease under my fingernails. At 28, Emily was finishing her final year as a law clerk at Patterson and Associates, and while she'd always been skeptical of what she called my expensive hobby, yesterday's events had shifted her perspective. Ethan, what Beverly did yesterday was completely insane, she said without preamble when she picked up. I've been thinking about it all night. Normal people don't just call the police with fake paperwork, unless they're either completely delusional or they're playing a much bigger game. That's when I made what most people would consider a counterintuitive decision. Instead of fighting to keep the Shelby in my garage where Beverly could continue harassing me, I decided to let it be temporarily impounded at the city's vehicle storage facility. Emily thought I'd lost my mind until I explained the logic. Look, Em, if she wants to play games with fake paperwork and mysterious phone calls to this Harold person, then I'm going to let her think she's winning while I figure out what's going on. What I didn't tell the police was that the Shelby had a backup GPS system that Dad had installed back in his racing days, hidden deep in the engine compartment and designed to be undetectable to casual inspection. Before they towed it away, I also managed to slip a second GPS tracker under the rear bumper, small enough to look like part of the original hardware. With the car safely stored in an official facility with round-the-clock security, I started doing what any good engineer does when faced with a complex problem. I began gathering data. Beverly's social media presence was a goldmine of information for someone who didn't seem to understand the concept of privacy settings. Her Facebook page showed a lifestyle that didn't quite match up with a suburban HOA president's typical income. Designer handbags, expensive restaurant check-ins, and photos from what looked like luxury car auctions in 3 different states. More interesting was her employment history, which Emily helped me dig up through public records. Beverly had previously worked at Green & Associates Real Estate, a company owned by one Harold Green. Ethan, look at this, Emily said, pulling up county records on her laptop. We were sitting in my kitchen, surrounded by printouts and sticky notes like some kind of suburban detective drama. Harold Green isn't just some random business associate. He's the chairman of the city council. And according to these property records, he's been involved in some pretty significant real estate transactions over the past 5 years. What made it even more interesting was that Beverly had left Green & Associates under what appeared to be less than ideal circumstances, right around the time she'd taken over as HOA president in our neighborhood. That evening, I decided to take a closer look at the device I'd seen Beverly glancing at yesterday. It wasn't a neighbor's hobby drone after all. Hidden in the bushes along my property line, I found a small listening device, the kind of thing you could order online for a couple of $100s. It was positioned perfectly to pick up conversations in my driveway and garage area, which explained how Beverly knew so much about the Shelby's technical specifications. She'd been eavesdropping on my phone calls with parts suppliers, my discussions with other car enthusiasts, and probably every conversation I'd had with Emily about the restoration project. The next morning brought an interesting development. Beverly had listed a 1,968 Shelby GT 500 for sale on 3 different online auction sites, complete with professional quality photos that had been taken in my garage. The asking price was $85,000, nearly double what the car was actually worth, and the description claimed it was a fully restored, numbers-matching Eleanor tribute car. What was particularly bold was that she was using photos of my car to advertise her sale, apparently confident that no one would be able to prove the connection. Emily's legal research revealed even more concerning information. Beverly wasn't just behind on her mortgage. She owed nearly $200,000 to various creditors including a substantial debt to a company called International Auto Ventures that seemed to specialize in overseas car sales. Her financial desperation explained the audacity of her scheme, but it also suggested that stealing one car, even an expensive one, wouldn't be enough to solve her problems. This felt like part of a larger pattern, which made me wonder how many other people in our neighborhood had been targeted. The GPS tracker I'd hidden on the Shelby sent its first alert that night. The car was moving, which should have been impossible since it was supposed to be secured in the city impound lot, but the signal wasn't coming from the impound facility. It was coming from a warehouse district about 20 miles outside of town. Either someone had officially released my car without notifying me, or Beverly had more connections and resources than I'd initially suspected. The signal stopped moving around midnight, settling at a location that Google Maps identified as Westside Storage Solutions. When I called the impound lot the next morning, they confirmed that my car was still in their custody and hadn't been moved. That meant Beverly's operation was sophisticated enough to either duplicate my car or they'd somehow gained access to a secured city facility. Emily's research into Harold Green was starting to paint a picture of someone with enough political connections to potentially influence how the local police handled property disputes. If Harold was the Harold that Beverly had mentioned, then this wasn't just about one desperate woman trying to steal a car. It was about someone with real power backing her play. Marcus Rodriguez, my retired neighbor who lived 3 houses down, knocked on my door that evening with information that changed everything. Marcus had always been friendly but distant, the kind of guy who kept to himself and maintained his property without getting involved in neighborhood drama. Ethan, I couldn't help but notice all the commotion yesterday, and I think there's something you should know about Beverly and this Harold Green character, he said, settling into one of my kitchen chairs with the deliberate movements of someone who decided to get involved. Last year, Harold came by my house 3 different times, supposedly just being neighborly, but he asked a lot of specific questions about my vintage motorcycle collection. A week after his 3rd visit, Beverly started citing me for HOA violations I'd never heard of before. The pattern was becoming clear, but the scope of it was bigger than I'd imagined. This wasn't a desperate woman making bad decisions. This was an organized operation targeting valuable personal property throughout our neighborhood, with someone in a position of political authority providing cover and legitimacy. As I stared at the GPS coordinates showing my car's location at a warehouse I'd never heard of, I realized that tomorrow would bring either answers or a whole new level of problems. If Beverly thought she could intimidate me into walking away from this fight, she was about to discover that engineers are very good at solving complex problems, especially when someone threatens the things we care most about. Emily arrived at my house with a box of Dad's old work files that I'd stored in the attic years ago. I couldn't sleep last night after what Marcus told us about Harold, she said, dumping the contents onto my kitchen table. Something about that name kept bothering me, so I figured we should see if Dad ever mentioned him. What we found in those yellow documents was like discovering a roadmap to a conspiracy I never knew existed. Buried in a 1995 company newsletter was a group photo from the annual aerospace company picnic, and there, standing next to my father with a forced smile, was a younger Harold Green. The caption identified him as Harold Green, Quality Assurance Manager, celebrating his promotion to senior oversight. Marcus had agreed to help us with surveillance, and his 40 years as a private investigator before retirement made him the perfect teacher for following someone undetected. The key is patience, he explained as we parked across from Beverly's house at 6 in the morning. People like her always have routines, and routines create opportunities. Beverly left her house at 7:30 sharp, driving her white BMW toward the warehouse district where my GPS tracker had gone silent 2 nights ago. What we found there made my stomach drop. The building was labeled Westside Storage Solutions, but it looked more like a staging area for expensive vintage vehicles. Through the chain link fence, we could see at least a dozen classic cars in various stages of preparation for transport. A 1967 Mustang that looked suspiciously like one I'd seen in Mrs. Patterson's garage. A vintage Harley Davidson that matched Marcus's description of his missing bike. And in the far corner, covered by a tarp but unmistakably familiar in its proportions, was my Shelby. This isn't just about your car, Marcus said quietly, taking photos with a telephoto lens. This is a systematic operation targeting the entire neighborhood's most valuable possessions. The scope of what we were looking at suggested resources and organization far beyond what Beverly could manage alone. Emily's research into Harold's business activities revealed disturbing patterns. Green & Associates specialized in estate liquidations and asset management, which sounded legitimate until you realized that most of their clients seemed to be elderly homeowners who had mysteriously decided to sell valuable possessions at below market prices. Look at this pattern, Emily said, showing me a spreadsheet she'd created. 15 different households in our neighborhood have sold cars, motorcycles, or collectibles through Harold's company in the past 2 years, all within 6 months of receiving HOA violations from Beverly. The coordination was too perfect to be coincidental. Jake Thompson, our neighborhood electrician, knocked on my door that evening with information that connected more dots. Ethan, I've been thinking about what you told me yesterday, and I remembered something weird, he said, clearly agitated. Last month, Beverly asked me to install some security upgrades around the neighborhood common areas, but when I looked at the equipment she wanted me to use, it wasn't standard security cameras. It was professional-grade surveillance stuff. stuff. Jake had refused the job, but he'd kept the equipment specifications, which Emily immediately recognized as monitoring devices capable of tracking vehicles and recording conversations from significant distances. Mrs. Patterson called me that afternoon with news that made everything click into place. The 85-year-old widow had been fighting HOA violations for months over her improperly stored vintage piano, which had belonged to her late husband. But here's the strange part, dear, she said in her shaky voice. Harold Green came by my house 3 times last month, asking very detailed questions about that piano. He knew it was a 1924 Steinway Model M. He knew about the custom modifications my husband had made, and he even asked about the original purchase documentation. How could he possibly know all that unless he'd been researching it? The pattern was becoming undeniable. Harold would research valuable items, Beverly would create HOA pressure, and then Harold's company would swoop in with convenient solutions. Emily's legal research had uncovered the most damning evidence yet. Beverly's debts weren't just personal financial problems. They were structured through a complex web of loans and business partnerships that all traced back to Harold Green's various companies. She's not just working for him, Emily explained, showing me corporate filings that revealed Beverly as a minority partner in 3 different businesses owned by Harold. She's financially dependent on him, which means she can't stop even if she wanted to. Bank records showed that Beverly had been making regular payments to something called International Auto Ventures for the past 18 months. The GPS tracker on my Shelby activated again that night, but this time the signal was heading toward the shipping district near the port, specifically to a facility that handled overseas container shipments. Emily and I followed at a distance, watching as Beverly supervised the loading of what appeared to be my car onto a truck headed for the shipping terminal. We need to call Agent Rebecca Taylor at Customs Enforcement, Emily said, dialing a number she'd researched earlier. If they're planning to ship stolen vehicles overseas, that makes this a federal crime, and it means we can stop this before your car disappears forever. As we watched the truck pull away from the warehouse, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was calm, measured, and completely confident. Hello, Ethan. This is Harold Green. I think it's time we had a conversation about your father and some unfinished business from a long time ago. The line went dead, but the message was clear. This wasn't just about my car anymore. This was about something that had started 30 years ago, and Harold Green had been planning this confrontation for longer than I'd ever imagined. Harold's phone call had rattled me more than I wanted to admit, but it also confirmed what I'd started to suspect after finding that old company photo. This wasn't just about stealing cars. This was personal, and it had been personal for 30 years. I spent the rest of the night going through every document in Dad's files, looking for any mention of Harold Green or anything that might explain why a city council chairman would hold a grudge against a dead man for 3 decades. What I found in a manila envelope marked insurance claims 1,995 made my blood run cold. There were copies of safety reports that Dad had filed about faulty aircraft components, all of them flagged for review by the Quality Assurance Department, all of them signed off on by Harold Green. Emily arrived before dawn with Agent Rebecca Taylor, a sharp-eyed customs enforcement officer who looked like she'd rather be chasing drug smugglers than dealing with suburban car theft. Mr. Miller, your sister has briefed me on the situation, and I have to tell you that what you're describing fits a pattern we've been tracking for the past 6 months, Agent Taylor said, spreading photos across my kitchen table. We've identified at least 3 similar operations in different states, all involving local officials who use their positions to identify and acquire valuable personal property for overseas sale. The photos showed shipping containers, warehouse facilities, and documentation that looked disturbingly similar to what we'd observed with Beverly's operation. The GPS tracker I'd hidden on the Shelby was sending signals from the port facility, but Agent Taylor explained that we couldn't simply raid the location without proper warrants and coordination with multiple agencies. The problem is that Harold Green has enough political connections to make any evidence we gather inadmissible if we don't follow proper procedures, she said. But there's another approach. If we can document the actual transfer of stolen property and catch them in the act of international shipping, we can build a case that even his lawyers can't dismiss. The plan was simple in concept, but terrifying in execution. We would let them think they were succeeding while gathering evidence of their crimes. As we sat in my garage, surrounded by the tools and parts that had been meant for the Shelby's restoration, I found myself thinking about Dad and the conversations we'd never gotten to have. Emily must have sensed my mood because she sat down next to me on the workbench where Dad used to teach me about engines. You know, I never understood why you spent so much time on that car, she said quietly, but watching you fight for it these past few days, I'm starting to realize it's not really about the car at all, is it? She was right, of course. The Shelby represented the last tangible connection I had to Dad, but more than that, it represented his values. The belief that some things are worth fighting for, that craftsmanship and integrity matter, and that you don't let bullies take what doesn't belong to them. Agent Taylor's phone buzzed with an update from the Port Authority. Your car is scheduled to be loaded onto a container ship bound for Dubai tomorrow morning at 6 a.m., she said. We've coordinated with international customs, but we need to catch them placing stolen property into international commerce. That means we wait until the last possible moment. The next 12 hours felt like the longest night of my life. Beverly had gone silent on social media, which probably meant she knew we were watching. Harold hadn't called back back, but somehow his silence felt more threatening than any confrontation would have been. Marcus joined us for the overnight surveillance, bringing coffee and the kind of professional-grade equipment that made me grateful for his friendship. "I've been thinking about this Harold character," he said as we settled in for a long night of watching the shipping facility through telephoto lenses. 40 years as a private investigator taught me that people like him don't usually start with elaborate criminal schemes. They start small, with little abuses of power, and gradually work their way up to bigger crimes. Your father probably wasn't his first victim, and you're not going to be his last. The thought was sobering, but it also made me more determined to see this through to the end. At 3 in the morning, Beverly's BMW pulled into the shipping facility, followed by a truck carrying what appeared to be my Shelby. Agent Taylor radioed for backup units to move into position, but she warned us that we still needed to wait for them to begin the loading process before we could intervene. The difference between conspiracy and committing international trafficking comes down to those few minutes when they're physically placing the stolen property into the shipping container, she explained. Through our surveillance equipment, we could see Beverly directing workers toward a specific container marked with the number BVLG 2024. But just as the workers began positioning the car lift near the container, my phone rang again. Harold's voice was calm as ever, but there was something different this time, something that sounded almost like satisfaction. "I hope you're enjoying the show, Ethan. But before this goes any further, I think you should know that your father wasn't the hero you think he was. Those safety reports he filed, they weren't about protecting people. They were about covering up his own mistakes. And when the FAA started asking questions, he was planning to disappear with a very large settlement and leave you and your mother to face the consequences. I felt the world tilt under my feet. Dad's final weeks had been stressful. I remembered that much, but I'd always assumed it was because of work pressure, not because he was involved in some kind of cover-up." Agent Taylor saw my expression and grabbed my arm. "Don't listen to him, Ethan. People like Harold are experts at psychological manipulation. He's trying to break your resolve right when we're closest to catching him." But the doubt was already there, planted like a seed in my mind. What if everything I thought I knew about Dad was wrong? What if this whole fight to save the Shelby was just about preserving a lie? As I watched the workers prepare to load my father's car into a shipping container bound for another continent, I realized that tomorrow would bring answers to questions I wasn't sure I wanted answered. But it was too late to back down now. We'd come too far, and Harold Green had made this too personal for any of us to walk away. At 5:47 a.m., Agent Taylor gave the signal that changed everything. "Go, go, go." She shouted into her radio as federal agents, port security, and local police converged on container BVLG 2024 from 3 different directions. The scene that unfolded was like something out of a movie, except this time I was standing in the middle of it, watching my father's car being used as evidence in what Agent Taylor later called the largest interstate property theft ring we've ever dismantled. Beverly was caught red-handed, literally holding a clipboard with shipping manifests for not just my Shelby, but 8 other classic vehicles that had been disappeared from neighborhoods across 3 different states. The look on Beverly's face when she realized she was surrounded was something I'll never forget. The confident, aggressive woman who had called the police on me just 4 days ago completely collapsed, falling to her knees on the concrete dock and sobbing like a child. "I didn't want to do this," she kept repeating as Agent Taylor read her rights. "Harold made me do it. He said if I didn't help him, he'd make sure I lost everything. He has files on all of us, recordings, photographs. You don't understand what he's capable of." It was the first time I'd seen Beverly show any genuine emotion, and despite everything she'd put me through, I almost felt sorry for her. Inside the container, we found not just stolen vehicles, but a carefully organized operation that revealed the true scope of Harold's criminal enterprise. Mrs. Patterson's 1924 Steinway piano was there, wrapped in protective padding and labeled for shipment to a collector in Germany. Marcus's vintage Harley-Davidson was created and ready for transport to Japan. Jake Thompson's father's collection of rare pocket watches was documented and cataloged like items in a museum. "This isn't just theft," Agent Taylor said as she photographed the evidence. "This is cultural heritage trafficking. These people were systematically stripping American communities of their most valuable historical artifacts." Beverly's confession, recorded right there on the dock with federal agents as witnesses, painted Harold Green as the mastermind of an operation that had been running for at least 5 years. He would research families in affluent neighborhoods, looking for elderly residents or people going through financial difficulties who owned valuable antiques or classic cars, she explained between sobs. Then he'd use his position on the city council to access property records, tax information, even insurance claims. Once he identified targets, I would create HOA violations or other municipal pressure to make their lives miserable until they were desperate enough to sell. The cold, calculated nature of the scheme was breathtaking in its cruelty. Harold's network extended far beyond our neighborhood. Beverly revealed that he had similar operations running in 15 different communities, each managed by a different HOA president or local official who was either being blackmailed or financially coerced into cooperation. "He keeps files on everyone," Beverly said, looking directly at me with red, swollen eyes. "Financial problems, family secrets, anything he can use as leverage. That's how he controlled me, and that's how he controlled the others." Agent Taylor immediately radioed for coordinated raids on all 15 locations, but I could see in her expression impression that this was going to be a much bigger case than anyone had anticipated. The moment when they finally uncovered my Shelby was both triumphant and heartbreaking. 2 years of restoration work had been carefully preserved. Harold's people knew exactly what they were dealing with and had treated the car with professional care. But seeing it there, wrapped and crated like merchandise, made me understand how Mrs. Patterson must have felt about her husband's piano. These weren't just valuable objects to the people who owned them. They were pieces of personal history, connections to loved ones, tangible memories that couldn't be replaced at any price. Beverly's live stream from the shipping container, broadcast to her 847 Facebook followers, became an inadvertent confession that went viral within hours. The video showed her breakdown in real time, complete with audio of her admitting to federal agents that she had been helping Harold Green steal from my neighbors for 3 years. The comments section exploded with reactions from people who had been affected by similar schemes in other states. This happened to my grandmother in Phoenix. One person wrote, she lost her husband's vintage guitar collection to someone just like this Harold Green. The live stream was shared over 50,000 times in the first 6 hours, turning Beverly into an unwitting symbol of suburban crime victimization. Harold Green arrived at the port facility just as Beverly was being loaded into a federal transport vehicle. Unlike Beverly's emotional collapse, Harold maintained his composure, stepping out of his black sedan with the confidence of someone who believed his political connections would protect him from consequences. Agent Taylor met him halfway across the parking lot, and I could see them talking, though I couldn't hear the conversation. But Harold's body language told the story. His shoulders sagged as Agent Taylor showed him photographs from inside the container, and his lawyer's confident expression disappeared when she handed him a federal warrant for his arrest. Mr. Miller, Agent Taylor called me over as Harold was being processed. Mr. Green has requested to speak with you privately before he's transported. You're under no obligation to agree to this, but he claims he has information about your father that you'll want to hear. Standing face to face with Harold Green for the first time, I was struck by how ordinary he looked. This man who had terrorized my neighborhood and destroyed so many families' treasured possessions looked like any other 60-year-old businessman in an expensive suit. But when he looked at me, his eyes held something that made my skin crawl. Your father discovered something about me 30 years ago that could have destroyed my career, Harold said, his voice steady despite the handcuffs. But before he could expose me, he died in that convenient racing accident. And do you know what I found when I went through his personal effects afterward? Evidence that he wasn't planning to be a hero at all. He was planning to blackmail me, just like I've been blackmailing others all these years. Harold smiled, and it was the coldest expression I'd ever seen on a human face. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree, Ethan. Your father was just like me, only he got caught before he could profit from it. Harold's accusation hit me like a physical blow, but before I could respond, Agent Taylor stepped between us with an expression that suggested she'd heard enough lies for one morning. Mr. Green, you have the right to remain silent, and I strongly suggest you exercise that right, she said firmly. Anything you say here can and will be used against you in federal court, but Harold wasn't finished with his psychological warfare. As the federal agents began leading him toward the transport vehicle, he turned back to me with that same cold smile. Ask your sister about the safety deposit box, Ethan. Ask her about what your father left behind. The comment was meant to plant more seeds of doubt, but something about the way he said it made Emily go pale. The ride back to my house was quiet, each of us processing what we'd witnessed at the port facility. Beverly was facing federal charges for interstate transportation of stolen property, conspiracy, and racketeering. Harold's arrest had triggered coordinated raids in 15 different cities, and Agent Taylor estimated that the total value of recovered stolen property would exceed $50 million. But despite the victory, Harold's final words about Dad kept echoing in my mind. Emily had been uncharacteristically quiet since Harold mentioned the safety deposit box, and when I asked her about it, she admitted that she'd found a key among Dad's personal effects years ago, but had never investigated what it opened. Meanwhile, Beverly's attempts to maintain her public image from federal custody provided the comic relief we desperately needed. Her daughter had smuggled a contraband cell phone into the detention facility, and Beverly was attempting to live stream her side of the story to her remaining Facebook followers. The connection was terrible. The video kept cutting out, and the audio made her sound like a malfunctioning robot. My dear friends, I want you to know that I've zooped completely innocent. Harold Green is the real BZAT criminal mastermind. The comments section was merciless. Lady, you confessed on live television this morning, wrote one viewer. Karen, EXE has stopped working, posted another. The technical difficulties reached their peak when Beverly tried to hold up a handwritten sign reading Harold equals Mastermind, but the frame rate was so bad that it looked like she was frantically waving a piece of paper while making incoherent sounds. The entertainment value of Beverly's failed live stream was interrupted by Agent Taylor's call with updates from the coordinated raids. Ethan, what we found in Harold's offices is going to blow this case wide open, she said, her voice containing a mixture of satisfaction and amazement. He kept detailed records of everything, victim profiles, financial analysis, psychological assessments, and even recordings of private conversations. This man documented his crimes like he was writing a how-to manual for organized theft. More importantly, for my peace of mind, they'd found Harold's insurance files, the blackmail material he'd used to control control his network of accomplices. Emily returned from the bank that afternoon with a manila envelope that contained the contents of Dad's safety deposit box. And what we found inside changed everything I thought I knew about the past month. There were indeed safety reports that Dad had filed about Harold's negligent approval of faulty aircraft components. But there was also something else. A complete audio recording of Harold threatening Dad's life if he didn't withdraw his reports to the FAA. If you think you can destroy my career with your self-righteous whistleblowing, you're making a very dangerous mistake. Harold's voice was clear and unmistakable on the 30-year-old cassette tape. Accidents happen to people who don't know when to keep their mouths shut. The recording was accompanied by a letter that Dad had written but never sent, addressed to the FBI and detailing Harold's pattern of corruption and intimidation. If something happens to me, the letter read, I want my family to know that I tried to do the right thing, even when it became dangerous. The final paragraph made my throat tighten. I'm not planning to disappear or abandon my family, as Harold has threatened to claim if I die under suspicious circumstances. I'm planning to use the evidence I've gathered to ensure that my son grows up in a world where people like Harold Green face consequences for their actions. Dad hadn't been planning to blackmail Harold. He'd been planning to bring him to justice, just like we were doing now. Harold's lawyer arrived at the federal building just as Beverly's live stream reached its comedic peak. She had convinced someone to help her get a better internet connection, but now the audio was crystal clear, while the video showed her in what appeared to be a detention facility bathroom. I need everyone to understand that Harold Green has been manipulating all of us, she shouted at the phone camera while fluorescent lighting flickered overhead. He has files on everyone in the neighborhood. He knows about your affairs, your debts, your secrets. The live chat exploded with responses ranging from concern to mockery. Ma'am, this is a Wendy's, someone commented, which somehow got over 500 likes. Beverly's attempt to expose Harold's blackmail operation turned into an inadvertent comedy show when she accidentally switched to the front-facing camera and spent 30 seconds talking to her confused reflection. Agent Taylor called us to the federal building for Harold's formal interrogation, where his composed facade finally began to crack. Faced with the audio recording from Dad's safety deposit box, Harold's lawyer immediately began negotiations for a plea agreement. My client is prepared to provide full cooperation with federal authorities in exchange for consideration in sentencing, the lawyer announced. But Harold himself looked like a man who just realized that 30 years of careful planning had been undone by evidence he'd never known existed. How long have you had that recording? He asked me directly, ignoring his lawyer's advice to remain silent. Since the day my father died, I replied, which wasn't technically true but felt emotionally accurate. He knew exactly what kind of person you were, and he made sure the truth would eventually come out. Harold's composure finally shattered completely. The man who had terrorized 15 neighborhoods, stolen millions of dollars in personal property, and destroyed countless families' treasured memories, broke down crying in a federal interrogation room. I never meant for anyone to get hurt, he sobbed, which was probably the first honest thing he'd said in decades. It started small, just a few items here and there, people who wouldn't miss them, but then it became easier and more profitable, and I couldn't stop. Beverly's live stream reached its absolute peak of unintentional comedy when she apparently tried to end the broadcast but accidentally started a new one instead. This time, she was clearly in a different location, possibly a holding cell, and she was talking to someone off camera who was a federal agent. What do you mean I can't get bail? She was saying, apparently unaware that hundreds of people were watching. I cooperated. I told you everything about Harold. I even gave you the spreadsheets. The agent's patient voice could be heard explaining that interstate trafficking charges typically don't qualify for bail, but Beverly kept interrupting with increasingly desperate arguments. But I have a dentist appointment on Thursday, and my book club meets on Friday. You can't just keep me here indefinitely. The comments section was having a field day. Karen wants to speak to the federal manager, read one particularly popular comment. As we left the federal building that evening, I felt something I hadn't experienced since this whole ordeal began. Genuine peace. Harold Green was facing federal charges that would likely result in a life sentence. Beverly would serve significant prison time but had avoided the worst penalties through her cooperation. Most importantly, Dad's reputation was not only intact but enhanced. He had died trying to stop the very crimes that had just been exposed 30 years later. The Shelby was mine again, legally and morally, and Harold's network of corruption had been dismantled across 3 states. But the real victory was simpler than all of that. Truth had finally won over lies, and justice had proven that it's never too late to arrive. 1 year later, I stood in my garage on a crisp Saturday morning, watching sunlight stream through the open door and dance across Eleanor's pristine chrome. The past 12 months had brought changes I never could have imagined when Beverly first called the police on me for stealing my car. The federal case against Harold Green had concluded with a life sentence without the possibility of parole, making him one of the oldest defendants ever convicted under the federal racketeering statutes. Beverly had received 7 years in federal prison but would likely serve less with good behavior and continued cooperation. More importantly, the victims of their scheme had recovered property worth over $47 million, and 15 different communities had dismantled their corrupt HOA systems in favor of transparent, democratically elected neighborhood councils. Emily had passed the bar exam and immediately opened her practice specializing in property rights and elder abuse cases. Her first major client was Mrs. Patterson, who had successfully sued Harold's estate for emotional distress and had used the settlement to establish a foundation that helped elderly victims of financial fraud. "I never thought I'd say this," Emily told me while reviewing case files at my kitchen table, "but watching you fight for that car taught me something important about what matters. It's not about the money or the objects themselves. It's about standing up to people who think they can take whatever they want just because they have power." Her practice was booming, mostly through referrals from other victims of similar schemes that had been exposed after Harold's arrest. Marcus Rodriguez had been elected as the first president of our new neighborhood council, a position he approached with the methodical thoroughness of a career investigator. His first official act was to establish a property protection protocol that required any complaints about residents' personal belongings to be reviewed by a 3-person committee and to include a mandatory cooling-off period before any action could be taken. "The goal is to make sure that nobody can ever again use bureaucratic pressure to target their neighbors," he explained during a community meeting that drew over 200 residents from surrounding neighborhoods. Marcus had also started a small consulting business helping other communities reform their HOA systems. Jake Thompson had used his settlement money from Harold's restitution fund to start Thompson Security Solutions, a company that specialized in protecting valuable personal property for collectors and enthusiasts. His first major contract was with a vintage car club that had been targeted by copycat criminals inspired by news coverage of Harold's operation. "The best part about this business," Jake told me while installing a state-of-the-art security system in my garage, "is that I get to help people protect the things they love instead of having to worry about who's trying to steal them." His company had expanded to 4 full-time employees and was considering opening a second location. Mrs. Patterson had become something of a celebrity advocate for victims' rights, traveling to speaking engagements across 3 states and testifying before legislative committees about the need for stronger protections against organized property theft. Her 1,924 Steinway piano, fully restored at Harold's expense, was now the centerpiece of a music therapy program she had established at the local senior center. "Harold thought he could steal my memories along with my husband's piano," she said during a television interview that aired on the anniversary of the arrests. "But what he didn't understand is that memories can't be shipped overseas in a container. They live in here," she said, tapping her chest, "and nobody can take them away." Agent Rebecca Taylor had been promoted to head the new Federal Property Crimes Task Force, a specialized unit created specifically to combat organized theft rings like Harold's operation. The task force had already disrupted 12 similar schemes in 8 different states, recovering over $200 million in stolen property and arresting 47 suspects. "The Harold Green case taught us that property crime isn't just about individual thieves," she explained during a press conference announcing the task force's first-year results. "It's about organized criminal enterprises that use legitimate institutions like government offices and homeowner associations as cover for systematic theft." The task force's success had led to congressional hearings about federal oversight of local housing authorities. Eleanor herself had become something of a local landmark, featured in car shows and community events as a symbol of perseverance and justice. "I had completed Dad's restoration exactly as he had planned it, using his detailed notes and sketches to guide every decision." The car now bore a small brass plaque on the dashboard reading, "In memory of David Miller, a man who chose truth over safety." But more importantly, the Shelby had inspired me to fulfill another of Dad's dreams. Using money from the Federal Restitution Fund and donations from community supporters, I had opened the David Miller Technical Training Center, a non-profit program that taught automotive and aerospace skills to young people from low-income families. The training center operated out of a converted warehouse donated by the city, complete with 4 working bays, a full machine shop, and classroom space for 30 students. Our first graduating class of 12 students had all found employment with local automotive and aerospace companies, with starting salaries that averaged $18 per hour. "Your father would be incredibly proud," Emily said as we watched our second class of students working on their first engine rebuild project. "He always believed that skills and integrity were the most valuable things you could give to young people." The program had a waiting list of over 100 applicants and had received inquiries from similar communities interested in replicating our model. Harold's final attempt at manipulation had backfired spectacularly. The USB drive he had kept as insurance contained not just evidence of his crimes, but also recordings that implicated 6 other local officials in various corruption schemes. The district attorney's office had used Harold's blackmail files to build cases against a county commissioner, 2 city planning officials, and 3 other HOA board members who had been part of his network. Harold thought he was so smart, keeping all that evidence to protect himself. Agent Taylor had told me during the final case debriefing, but criminals always make the same mistake. They assume everyone else is as corrupt as they are, so they don't realize that honest people will eventually use their evidence against them. The community that had been nearly destroyed by Harold's Harold's scheme, was now stronger and more united than ever. Property values in our neighborhood had increased after the publicity from the case, as buyers specifically sought out areas with reformed governance and strong community oversight. The annual Harold Green Memorial Car Show that we organized each summer had become a regional attraction, drawing vintage car enthusiasts from across the state and raising money for victims assistance programs. Memorial was perhaps not the most accurate term, since Harold was still very much alive in federal prison, but nobody seemed inclined to change the name of an event that had brought so much positive attention to our community. As I closed the garage door that morning and prepared to drive the Eleanor to our monthly cars and coffee gathering, I reflected on how much had changed since that first confrontation with Beverly. Harold had tried to destroy our community and steal our most treasured possessions, but his crimes had ultimately brought us together in ways that simple neighborly cooperation never could have achieved. The Shelby's engine purred with the same perfect tune that Dad had intended, but now it carried the voices of an entire community that had learned to stand up for itself. Sometimes justice comes quickly, and sometimes it takes 30 years. But the most important lesson I'd learned was that it always comes eventually, especially when good people refuse to give up the fight. What would you have done if your neighbor called 911 claiming you stole your own car? Would you have fought back like Ethan, or given in to the pressure? This story proves that justice isn't always immediate, but it's always worth the fight. If this tale of suburban corruption and family legacy kept you hooked, hit that subscribe button for more Block Stories, where truth triumphs over lies.